Daniel Carter didn't hesitate. In the middle of a charity reception with business leaders, neighbors, and old family friends watching, he placed a suitcase at Danielle White's feet and calmly told her to leave the master bedroom. Standing beside him, Olivia Parker smiled as though she had already inherited the mansion. Danielle said nothing. She simply looked around the home everyone believed belonged to her husband. None of them knew that the mansion and an empire far beyond it had never been Daniel's to claim. By the time the truth emerged, no apology would be able to erase what had happened that evening. If you believe dignity is measured by how someone treats the weakest person in the room, share where you're watching from and your local time in the comments. And if stories of quiet strength, truth, and justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Part 2. Morning sunlight spilled across the eastern lawn of the White estate, touching the stone walls with the kind of quiet warmth that made the mansion appear timeless. To strangers driving past its iron gates, it looked like the home of a powerful family whose fortune had endured for generations. Inside, however, there was little of the glamour people imagined. Danielle White preferred silence to luxury. She woke before sunrise every morning, long before Daniel Carter climbed out of bed to check stock prices, answer business emails, or scroll through photographs of people whose lives he wished to imitate. While he chased the image of success, Danielle found comfort in routines that required no audience. She watered the flowers growing beneath the kitchen windows. She brewed coffee from the same ceramic pot her grandfather had once given her mother. She opened every curtain herself instead of asking the house staff to do it. The employees often offered to help, but Danielle politely declined. She had never become comfortable with people serving her, even after moving into the enormous estate shortly after marrying Daniel. To Daniel, the mansion represented status. To Danielle, it was simply home. She rarely thought about how unusual it was to live in a residence filled with handcrafted woodwork, imported marble fireplaces, and paintings that had remained on the walls for decades. She appreciated the beauty without wondering about its price. That difference between husband and wife had once seemed charming. Over time, it became impossible to ignore. Years earlier, when they first met, Daniel had been confident without appearing arrogant. He spoke passionately about building a successful real estate company, creating opportunities for young professionals, and giving his future family a comfortable life. Danielle admired his ambition. She believed hard work deserved encouragement. She never imagined ambition could slowly transform into obsession. After their wedding, Daniel's business grew quickly, but so did his appetite for recognition. Small victories no longer satisfied him. Every promotion inspired a larger purchase. Every successful project demanded another expensive celebration. New watches, imported sports cars, private club memberships, luxury vacations that existed mainly for photographs shared online. Danielle noticed the changes long before anyone else did, but she chose patience over confrontation. Whenever she asked whether their spending was becoming excessive, Daniel would laugh and assure her that successful people had to look successful first. Appearance creates opportunity, he often said. Danielle never argued. She simply remembered. Keeping quiet had become one of her habits, though not because she lacked opinions. She possessed a remarkable memory for details. She remembered conversations almost word for word. She remembered dates, receipts, promises, and inconsistencies. When something felt wrong, she wrote it down. Inside the top drawer of an antique writing desk sat a collection of small leather notebooks. Each contained observations from ordinary days. The plumber arrived at 9:20. The accountant called twice. Daniel returned home after midnight. A delivery addressed to someone she did not recognize. None of the notes accused anyone of wrongdoing. Danielle simply believed that facts became valuable when emotions eventually faded. It was a lesson her grandfather had taught her years before. People forget, he had once told her. Paper doesn't. She had smiled at the advice then. She understood it much better now. Daniel often teased her for writing everything down. "You'd make a terrible spy," he joked one evening. "You keep records of grocery lists." Danielle smiled politely. "I just don't like forgetting." Neither of them realized how important those notebooks would someday become. By late morning, Daniel had already left for another meeting in the city. Danielle wandered through the gardens, carrying a small basket for fresh herbs. The estate stretched across acres of carefully maintained land, with winding stone paths disappearing beneath centuries-old oak trees. Near the western greenhouse, Thomas Walker was trimming rose bushes. Thomas had served the White estate for more than 40 years. His silver hair, straight posture, and calm expression gave him the appearance of someone who belonged to another generation. Every employee respected him, though few understood exactly why. He greeted Danielle with the same quiet courtesy every morning. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." "Good morning, Thomas. You'll have rain before evening." She looked toward the clear blue sky. "It doesn't look like it." Thomas smiled gently. "Some storms arrive before the clouds do." Danielle laughed softly, assuming he was speaking about gardening. Thomas knew better. For weeks, confidential letters had continued arriving from Jonathan Hayes, the senior attorney responsible for administering the White family trust. Every envelope bore Danielle's full legal name. Every envelope was marked confidential. Every envelope disappeared before reaching her hands. Thomas had seen Daniel collect the mail himself more than once, claiming he wanted to organize household paperwork. He had watched the attorney's letters vanish into Daniel's study. The old caretaker said nothing, not yet. His responsibility required patience. The trust documents contained strict legal instructions that prevented him from revealing certain information before official procedures began. Breaking those instructions could compromise everything Jonathan Hayes had spent months preparing. Still, each unopened letter increased Thomas's concern. The succession deadline was approaching. Inside his downtown office, Jonathan Hayes stood beside a wall covered with framed legal certificates, earned over 4 decades of practice. His assistant entered carrying another returned envelope. "It came back again." Jonathan accepted it without speaking. Across the front appeared the familiar stamp, "Unclaimed." He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. How many now? 5 certified letters. And the emails? No replies. The phone calls? Straight to voicemail. Jonathan walked toward the large window overlooking the city. Everything had been carefully arranged years before. Danielle's late grandfather had anticipated every legal challenge that could arise after his death. The trust required multiple layers of verification before any inheritance could be disclosed. Every signature, every record, every family document, every property title, every corporate ownership certificate. Nothing could be rushed. But one requirement remained impossible to satisfy. The heir had to receive official notification. Without that final step, billions of dollars in assets remained locked inside legal protections that would soon require judicial intervention. Jonathan had spent months trying to avoid involving the courts. He preferred privacy. So had Danielle's grandfather. Yet time was running out. Back at the mansion, Danielle spent the afternoon organizing shelves inside the old library. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight as she carefully arranged family photo albums that no one else seemed interested in opening. One photograph caught her attention. She recognized herself as a little girl sitting beside her grandfather on the front steps of the estate. She smiled sadly. He had always seemed larger than life, kind, patient, wise. After his funeral many years earlier, distant relatives handled every legal matter. Danielle had been told the family's remaining properties would eventually be sold to settle various obligations. She never questioned the explanation. She trusted people too easily then. The mansion had somehow remained in the family after her marriage, but Daniel always explained that complicated financial agreements made purchasing it surprisingly affordable. She believed him. She had never asked to see the paperwork. Ownership had never mattered to her. Home did. As evening settled over the estate, dark clouds finally gathered across the horizon, exactly as Thomas had predicted. Wind stirred the old trees surrounding the mansion. Rain began softly. Standing beneath the front porch roof, Thomas watched headlights disappear beyond the front gates as Daniel returned home hours later than expected. The old caretaker's eyes drifted toward the mailbox. Another certified envelope rested inside. Another confidential notice addressed to Danielle White. Thomas quietly removed it before Daniel reached the front door. For the first time in 40 years, he made a decision without waiting for permission. Tomorrow, he would find another way to place the letter into Danielle's hands. Some storms he knew arrived before the rain. The affair did not begin with love. It began with admiration that fed Daniel Carter's pride at precisely the moment his confidence had started to crack. For months, his real estate company had looked successful from the outside. New projects were announced with polished presentations. Industry magazines occasionally mentioned his name. Photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies filled his social media pages. Behind the polished image, however, the numbers were quietly turning against him. Construction costs had climbed faster than expected. Several investors delayed promised funding. 2 commercial developments remained unfinished after subcontractors demanded payment Daniel could no longer provide. Cash flow tightened. Credit lines shrank. Invoices accumulated inside locked desk drawers. Daniel responded the only way he believed successful men should. He hid the truth. Instead of reducing expenses, he expanded them. Instead of admitting uncertainty, he rented more expensive office space. Instead of slowing down, he doubled the pace. Every decision was designed to convince the world that nothing was wrong. The first time he met Olivia Parker, she praised exactly what he wanted people to notice. "You don't look like someone who's struggling," she said during a charity fundraiser downtown. Daniel smiled. "I'm not." Olivia glanced toward the luxury sedan parked outside. "I knew it." Unlike Danielle, Olivia admired visible success. She complimented expensive watches. She noticed tailored suits. She admired private clubs and exclusive restaurants. More importantly, she never questioned how those things were paid for. Daniel found her refreshing. Within weeks, lunches became dinners. Dinners became weekends disguised as business trips. Eventually, secrecy became routine. Whenever Danielle asked whether another conference required overnight travel, Daniel answered with calm confidence. "The investors are demanding." She simply nodded. "I hope everything goes well." He almost wished she would accuse him. An argument would have been easier to justify than her quiet trust. Danielle never searched his phone, never followed him, never hired investigators. She believed that if someone wanted to deceive another person, the deception always ended eventually. Truth required less effort than lies. The narrator already knew she was right. Every lie Daniel told required another one to support it. Every promise created another contradiction. Every hidden meeting left another trace. Olivia enjoyed living inside Daniel's illusion of success. She often joked that they were already behaving like the city's newest power couple. "When the divorce is finished," she said one evening over dinner, "people will finally see who really belongs beside you." Daniel leaned back confidently. "It won't take long." "What about the house?" he smiled. "Danielle has nowhere else to go." Olivia raised an eyebrow. I thought it belonged to her family. Danielle laughed dismissively. That's ancient history. Are you sure? I've lived there for years. Her grandfather died a long time ago. Everything important was settled. Olivia accepted the explanation without asking another question. Daniel accepted it because he wanted to believe it himself. The truth was simpler. He had never actually verified who legally owned the mansion. He had simply assumed that marriage possession and time had made the property effectively his. Assumptions, however, carried no legal authority. Across the city, Jonathan Hayes stared at Danielle White's unopened file. His office shelves held thousands of legal documents accumulated throughout 4 decades of practice. Very few frustrated him. This one did. His assistant entered carrying another folder. I contacted the forwarding service. Jonathan looked up. And they confirmed Mrs. White still resides at the estate. Jonathan frowned. Then why hasn't she responded? We don't know. He considered the possibilities carefully. Perhaps Danielle was traveling? Perhaps she intentionally ignored legal correspondence. Or perhaps someone else was preventing the letters from reaching her. It was no longer a possibility he could dismiss. Prepare another certified package. We already sent 5. I know. And email. Again. The phone. Again. His assistant hesitated. What if someone else answers? Jonathan's expression hardened. Then we asked to speak directly with Danielle White. He deliberately emphasized her maiden name. The trust recognized no other identity, not until every inheritance procedure had been completed. Meanwhile, Thomas Walker continued noticing small changes inside the mansion. Daniel now insisted on collecting the mail personally every afternoon. Packages addressed to Danielle occasionally disappeared into his office. Phone messages left on the landline were erased before dinner. Twice, Thomas saw Daniel reading confidential envelopes before quietly locking them inside a drawer. The old caretaker said nothing. Instead, he recorded dates, times, tracking numbers, delivery companies. He wrote each observation inside a worn notebook he kept in his office near the maintenance garage. 40 years of serving the White family had taught him one principle above all others. Memory faded. Documentation endured. One rainy afternoon, Danielle found Thomas repairing an old garden bench. You always fix things before anyone asks. Thomas smiled gently. It saves trouble later. She sat beside him beneath a covered gazebo. I wish people worked that way. He studied her face for a moment. You've seemed worried recently. She hesitated. Daniel has been distracted. Business, I suppose. She looked toward the mansion. We hardly talk anymore. Thomas chose his words carefully. Sometimes silence hides problems. Danielle gave a faint smile. And sometimes it protects peace. Neither statement was entirely wrong. Thomas wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to place Jonathan's confidential letters directly into her hands. He wanted to explain why certain legal deadlines mattered. He wanted to reveal the promise he had made decades earlier to Danielle's grandfather. Instead, he remained silent. Legal obligations carried consequences. Breaking confidentiality, even for compassionate reasons, could jeopardize the succession itself. So he waited. Waiting had become the most difficult part of loyalty. That same week, Daniel attended another meeting with his bank. The atmosphere inside the conference room differed sharply from previous visits. No one offered casual conversation. No one complimented future developments. Instead, loan officers quietly reviewed spreadsheets. One executive folded his hands. Mr. Carter, we require additional collateral before extending your current credit facility. Daniel maintained a confident expression. My residential property should be sufficient. Can you provide verified ownership documentation? Of course. When? Daniel answered too quickly. Tomorrow. The executive nodded. We'll wait. Daniel left the building wearing the same confident smile he had carried inside. It disappeared before he reached the parking garage. He had no ownership documents, not a single one. He had never needed them before. Surely obtaining copies would be simple. After all, he lived there. Paid maintenance, paid utilities. Everyone believed it was his home. That should be enough, shouldn't it? The narrator already understood what Daniel refused to consider. Occupying a house and owning it were two entirely different legal realities. Back at the estate, Olivia wandered through the master bedroom, while Danielle quietly organized winter clothing inside the guest room she had chosen herself weeks earlier, whenever Daniel began sleeping elsewhere under the excuse of business travel. Olivia ran her fingers across expensive furniture. You deserve better than this old place, she teased during a phone call with Daniel. He laughed. Wait until the renovations. We'll modernize everything. The walls, the floors, the library, even the gardens. Danielle overheard only fragments was passing through the hallway. She did not interrupt. Instead, she noticed Olivia referring to rooms as though she already lived there. She remembered the conversation. Later that evening, she opened one of her leather notebooks. She wrote only 3 sentences. Olivia referred to the master suite as hers. Daniel did not correct her. Conversation overheard at 7:42 p.m. Then she closed the notebook. No accusation, no speculation, only facts. Hundreds of miles away inside the headquarters of White Mining Group, Margaret Collins stood before a secure conference table surrounded by senior executives. Andrew Foster distributed confidential financial summaries. No one spoke until the final folder reached every seat. Margaret finally broke the silence. The succession window closes soon. Andrew nodded. Our attorneys still haven't completed notification. What happens if the deadline expires? Court supervision becomes unavoidable. Silence settled across the room. Everyone understood what was at stake. The White mining empire controlled billions of dollars in assets spread across mining operations. Rail transportation, mineral processing facilities, renewable energy investments, and international supply contracts. Yet, despite its enormous influence, the company still belonged by law to a single unidentified heir waiting for legal confirmation. Margaret looked toward the sealed file bearing one name: Danielle White. She had never met the woman, but every executive in the room knew one thing. Until Danielle accepted her inheritance, the future of the entire empire remained suspended between secrecy and time. The moving truck arrived just after 9 on a bright Saturday morning. Its polished white exterior looked strangely cheerful against the old stone walls of the White estate. 2 movers climbed out, followed by a delivery van carrying designer furniture wrapped in protective blankets. Danielle watched from the breakfast room window without saying a word. She had not been told anyone was moving into the house. A few minutes later, Daniel's black SUV rolled through the front gates. Olivia Parker stepped out first. She wore oversized sunglasses, a cream-colored designer dress, and the relaxed smile of someone expecting to be welcomed home. Daniel hurried around the vehicle to open the door for her before either of them acknowledged Danielle, standing quietly on the front porch. Good morning, Danielle said softly. Daniel barely looked at her. We're busy today. Olivia smiled politely, though the warmth never reached her eyes. I hope you don't mind a little noise. Danielle glanced toward the moving truck. It looks like more than a little. Daniel folded his arms. Olivia is staying here. The sentence landed with astonishing calm. No apology, no explanation, simply a declaration. Danielle searched his face, almost expecting him to admit this was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he continued speaking with the confidence of someone announcing a business decision. It's temporary. She needs somewhere comfortable while her condo is being renovated. Olivia nodded enthusiastically. It shouldn't be inconvenient. Danielle noticed the movers carrying suitcases toward the front entrance. There were far too many for a temporary guest. Still, she remained composed. If that's your decision. Danielle frowned slightly. That's all you're going to say? She looked at him. What would you like me to say? For a brief moment, he seemed almost disappointed. He had prepared himself for tears, accusations, a dramatic confrontation. Instead, he received quiet acceptance. He mistook her composure for weakness. The narrator already knew it was something else entirely. Danielle understood that arguments rarely change dishonest minds. Facts did. Inside the entrance hall, Olivia slowly examined every detail of the mansion. The ceilings are incredible. Danielle smiled proudly. I told you. She walked toward the grand staircase. I already have ideas. Within an hour, decorators began carrying rolls of fabric-framed artwork and expensive lighting fixtures into the master suite. The bedroom Danielle and Daniel had once shared gradually transformed into a construction zone. New curtains, new bedding, new furniture. Boxes filled with Olivia's clothing. Danielle quietly entered the room only once. She opened the closet, removed her remaining sweaters, collected a small wooden jewelry box inherited from her grandmother. Then she carried everything downstairs without speaking. Olivia watched from the doorway. You can leave whatever you don't want. Danielle smiled politely. I don't leave personal things behind. The answer puzzled Olivia. She had expected bitterness. Instead, Danielle sounded almost peaceful. As workers continued unpacking, Olivia wandered through the mansion, making decisions as though she already owned it. This painting should come down. The dining chairs are outdated. We'll replace the rugs. The wallpaper in the library has to go. Danielle agreed with nearly every suggestion. Neither of them noticed Thomas Walker standing quietly near the hallway entrance. The old estate manager carried a clipboard as usual. Whenever contractors entered the property, he documented their work. That morning, however, he added something unusual. He photographed every room before changes began, every painting, every antique cabinet, every family portrait, every historical fixture. When one contractor removed an oil painting that had hung above the main staircase for decades, Thomas politely asked him to pause. I need one photograph first. The contractor shrugged. No problem. Click. The image joined dozens of others stored inside Thomas's secure digital archive. He wasn't preserving decorations. He was preserving evidence. Because the mansion itself remained part of the White family trust, every permanent alteration required formal authorization from the legal owner. No such authorization existed. Jonathan Hayes had already warned Thomas months earlier. Document everything. Say very little. Thomas intended to follow both instructions. Later that afternoon, Danielle carried several boxes toward the guest bedroom at the end of the second-floor hallway. The room was considerably smaller than the master suite. Its windows overlooked the gardens instead of the front lawn. The furniture was simple but comfortable. She arranged her books neatly on the shelves, placed framed family photographs beside the bed, folded her clothes carefully inside the wardrobe. Nothing about the room suggested defeat. It simply reflected someone determined to maintain order despite uncertainty. Thomas quietly knocked on the open door. "May I help?" "I'm almost finished." He looked around. "You've made it feel like home already." Danielle smiled faintly. "A home isn't measured by the size of the bedroom." Thomas nodded. "No, it isn't." He wished he could tell her that she would never belong in that guest room. Legally, every bedroom in the mansion belonged equally to her. But the law still required silence. As evening approached, Olivia invited several friends to tour the estate. Champagne glasses appeared. Music drifted through the downstairs rooms. Laughter echoed beneath ceilings that had once hosted generations of Danielle's family. One guest admired the architecture. "This place must be worth a fortune." Olivia wrapped an arm around Daniel. "It really is." Another guest asked casually, "How long have you owned it?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Long enough to know every corner." It wasn't technically an answer, but nobody questioned him. Danielle passed through the hallway carrying fresh towels toward the laundry room. Conversations briefly stopped. Several guests glanced awkwardly between the married couple. One woman quietly asked Olivia, "Who is she?" Olivia smiled. "A relative who's staying here for a while." Danielle heard every word. She kept walking. No correction, no protest, only silence. Thomas observed the exchange from across the room. Later, after the guests left, he wrote down the exact time. 7:18 p.m. Guest falsely informed Danielle was merely staying temporarily. Witnesses present 6. He closed the notebook. Facts, nothing more. The following Monday, Jonathan Hayes convened an emergency meeting inside his law firm's conference room. Stacks of legal files covered the polished oak table. 2 associate attorneys reviewed timelines, while a paralegal projected trust documents onto a large screen. Jonathan remained standing. "We have exhausted ordinary notification procedures." One associate nodded. "Certified mail, email, telephone, courier delivery, all unsuccessful." Jonathan looked toward another attorney. "What alternatives remain?" "Petition for limited judicial authorization." He sighed. "I hope to avoid involving the court." So did Mr. White. Everyone understood whom he meant. Danielle's grandfather had insisted the inheritance remain as private as possible. Public attention would expose not only family matters, but also one of the largest privately held mining corporations in the country. Jonathan spoke quietly. "If someone is intentionally preventing Danielle White from receiving legal correspondence, we may be running out of time." The room fell silent. No one needed to speculate who that person might be. Across the country, inside the executive headquarters of White Mining Group, Margaret Collins reviewed preparations for the company's annual leadership conference. The succession announcement had been carefully planned months in advance. A secure auditorium, restricted invitations, board resolutions, updated ownership certificates. Andrew Foster entered carrying another confidential report. "Our legal department needs another extension." Margaret looked up. "Has the heir been located?" "Yes." "Has she been officially notified?" Andrew shook his head. "Not yet." Margaret stared through the office windows, overlooking the sprawling mining headquarters. Thousands of employees depended upon decisions made inside that building every day. Yet the rightful owner remained unaware that an empire worth billions waited behind sealed legal documents. "We continue preparing," Margaret said. "And if the deadline arrives, we follow the law." No one argued. The law had protected the White family's legacy for generations. It would continue doing so. Back at the mansion, Danielle stepped outside just before sunset. She walked slowly through the rose garden where her grandfather had once taught her how to prune climbing roses without damaging new growth. The flowers had begun blooming again. She knelt beside one of the oldest bushes. Its blossoms remained beautiful despite a broken support trellis leaning to one side. Carefully, she straightened the wooden frame and secured it with fresh twine. The plant had never stopped growing. It had simply needed quiet support. From the porch, Thomas watched without interrupting. He realized the same truth applied to Danielle. The world around her had become increasingly dishonest. Yet she continued choosing patience over anger. Order over chaos, grace over humiliation. He looked toward the mansion, where Olivia's laughter echoed through open windows, while workers continued redesigning rooms they had no legal authority to change. Thomas slipped a small, sealed envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket. It bore only 5 words. For Danielle White. Confidential. Tomorrow, he decided waiting would no longer be enough. Monday morning began with unusual tension. Daniel rarely ate breakfast at home anymore, but that day he sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone while untouched coffee grew cold beside him. Every few minutes, another notification appeared on the screen. He read each message quickly before locking the device and forcing himself to appear calm. Danielle noticed the pattern. She did not ask who was writing. She simply poured herself another cup of coffee and opened the notebook she used to organize grocery lists and household expenses. Across the table, Daniel finally spoke. "I'll be out most of the week." "Another project?" Danielle asked. "Several. You may not see much of me." She nodded. "I hope everything goes well." Daniel waited for another question. There wasn't one. He stood, collected his briefcase, and hurried toward the front entrance. The moment the front door closed, another message appeared on his phone. "Urgent. Please return my call today." It came from one of the banks financing his latest commercial development. He ignored it. Outside, Thomas Walker watched Daniel drive away far faster than necessary. The old estate manager had lived long enough to recognize the difference between confidence and panic. Daniel was no longer driving toward opportunity. He was driving away from problems. Inside the mansion, Olivia slowly descended the staircase wearing an expensive silk robe. She had become increasingly comfortable behaving as though she belonged there. She entered the kitchen without acknowledging Danielle. "I ordered new furniture." Danielle looked up politely. "I noticed the delivery trucks. The old dining set is outdated." Olivia opened the refrigerator. "We're replacing it." Danielle answered quietly. "It's beautiful craftsmanship." Olivia shrugged. "It looks old." She walked away before waiting for a response. Danielle remained seated for another moment. Then she opened one of her leather notebooks. Date, time, conversation. She wrote only what had been said, nothing more. Thomas entered carrying maintenance reports. As he passed the kitchen, he noticed Danielle writing again. "You still keep records?" She smiled gently. "It helps me think." He nodded. Sometimes written facts become more valuable than memories. She looked at him with mild curiosity. "My grandfather used to say something similar." Thomas smiled faintly. He was a wise man. For a brief moment, he almost reached into his jacket to retrieve the confidential envelope. Almost. Instead, he placed fresh flowers inside a vase near the window and quietly returned to his duties. His hesitation troubled him. Every instinct told him Danielle deserved the truth. Every legal obligation required patience. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel entered the headquarters of Crescent National Bank. The atmosphere felt noticeably colder than during previous visits. Instead of greeting him in a private executive office, the receptionist escorted him into a formal conference room. 3 people waited inside: a senior loan officer, a corporate attorney, a risk analyst. None of them smiled. The loan officer folded his hands. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming." Daniel returned the greeting confidently. "I assume we're finalizing the expansion loan." The attorney slid a folder across the table. "Before discussing additional financing, we'd like clarification regarding collateral listed in your application." Daniel opened the folder. Photographs of the mansion, property descriptions, estimated market values, everything appeared normal. "The residence is valuable," he said. "It certainly is," the analyst replied. "We've been unable to verify ownership." Daniel forced a calm expression. "The records must be delayed. Our title search found inconsistencies. I'll provide updated documents." "When?" "Tomorrow." The attorney leaned forward. "We've heard that before." Silence settled across the room. Daniel realized they no longer trusted his assurances. "We'll need certified ownership verification," the loan officer continued. "Without it, we cannot proceed." Daniel stood a few minutes later carrying the same folder. Outside the building, he remained inside his parked car for nearly 10 minutes without starting the engine. His confidence was beginning to fracture. He had assumed obtaining ownership documents would be easy. Instead, every request encountered unexplained delays. The county records office required additional verification. His attorney needed older files. The mortgage company had incomplete archives. Nothing seemed straightforward. For the first time, an uncomfortable question entered his mind. What if the mansion had never legally belonged to him? He immediately dismissed the thought. Impossible. He had lived there for years, paid bills, maintained the property. Everyone recognized him as the owner. That had to count for something. The narrator already knew the answer. It counted for appearances, not ownership. At nearly the same hour, Andrew Foster sat inside White Mining Group's financial headquarters, reviewing an unusual report submitted by the Corporate Compliance Department. Several pages contained inquiries from financial institutions requesting verification of assets connected to the White Family Trust. One address appeared repeatedly: the mansion. Andrew frowned. No authorization had been issued allowing the property to support private loans. He pressed the intercom. "Emily, could you come in?" His assistant entered carrying a tablet. "Yes, Mr. Foster." "I need every inquiry involving the estate over the past 12 months." She looked surprised. "Everyone." "Everyone." Within 20 minutes, folders covered his desk. Banks, private lenders, commercial financing firms, insurance companies. The pattern became obvious. Someone had repeatedly attempted to leverage trust property without permission. Andrew immediately called Jonathan Hayes. "I believe we have a problem." Jonathan listened carefully. "Can you prove unauthorized inquiries?" "I can." "How many?" "More than I expected." Jonathan remained silent for several seconds. "Don't contact the banks yet. You want documentation first." "I want certified documentation." Andrew understood. Evidence became stronger when gathered carefully instead of emotionally. "I'll begin immediately." "Thank you." After ending the call, Jonathan added another note to Danielle's succession file. "Potential financial misrepresentation. Supporting documentation pending." Everything continued pointing toward one conclusion. Someone believed they possessed authority they had never legally received. Late that afternoon, Danielle visited the local grocery store. She enjoyed shopping alone. The ordinary routines helped clear her mind. As she walked through the produce section, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She answered politely. "This is Danielle." Silence. Then the call disconnected. She frowned slightly before placing the phone back into her purse. Across town, Jonathan lowered his receiver. "Straight to voicemail again?" his assistant asked. "No." "What happened?" Someone answered. His expression tightened. The connection ended immediately. He checked the number carefully. It matched Danielle's records exactly. Someone had answered. Whether intentionally or accidentally remained unclear. Back at the mansion that evening, Daniel arrived unusually late. He appeared exhausted. His tie hung loosely around his neck. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he hadn't slept well in days. Olivia greeted him enthusiastically. "I've been looking at Italian marble." Daniel barely listened. "That's nice. We should renovate the foyer next." He rubbed his forehead. "Not tonight." She frowned. "You've been saying that a lot." "I'm tired." She crossed her arms. "I thought everything was going well." "It is." "You don't sound convincing." Daniel walked toward his office without another word. Olivia watched him disappear down the hallway. For the first time since moving into the mansion, uncertainty crept into her expression. Something was changing. She simply didn't know what. Upstairs, Danielle quietly organized household paperwork she had collected over several months. Utility bills, maintenance invoices, insurance notices, garden expenses. Among them lay a single envelope that immediately caught her attention. It had accidentally been delivered with ordinary mail after slipping between advertising flyers. Across the front appeared unfamiliar handwriting. Confidential Miss Danielle White. Not Mrs. Carter. Not Danielle Carter. Danielle White. She stared at it for several seconds. The envelope had already been opened. Its contents were gone. Only the empty envelope remained. Someone else had removed whatever had once been inside. She turned it over carefully. The return address belonged to a law firm she did not recognize. Jonathan Hayes and Associates. Danielle looked thoughtfully toward the hallway. She did not accuse anyone. She did not rush downstairs demanding explanations. Instead, she placed the empty envelope inside one of her notebooks. Then she wrote 4 quiet lines beneath the date. Confidential envelope, addressed to Danielle White. Contents missing before arrival, retained as evidence. Downstairs, Thomas watched rain begin falling beyond the tall windows. When he saw Danielle carefully placing the empty envelope inside her notebook, he realized something important. The truth had finally found its first small opening. And once truth entered a story, it rarely left unnoticed. Rain continued through the night, washing the stone walkways and filling the gardens with the earthy scent that Danielle had always loved. By dawn, the estate looked peaceful again. The storm had passed, leaving only droplets clinging to rose petals and the ancient oak branches that lined the driveway. Inside the mansion, however, another kind of storm had only begun. Danielle woke earlier than usual. The empty envelope remained on her bedside table. She picked it up again, studying every detail. Jonathan Hayes and Associates. The firm meant nothing to her. Neither did the handwritten word confidential across the front. What unsettled her most was not the missing letter. It was the fact that someone had already opened it before she ever saw it. She turned the envelope over once more. There were no answers, only questions. After dressing, she tucked the envelope into her notebook before heading downstairs. Thomas Walker was already arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." "Good morning, Thomas." She hesitated. "May I ask you something?" His expression remained calm. Of course. She removed the empty envelope from her notebook. Have you ever heard of this law firm? Thomas recognized it instantly. He had seen Jonathan Hay's name on dozens of confidential documents over the past year. Still, he answered carefully, I've heard the name. Do you know why they would write to me? I couldn't say. Danielle looked disappointed, but not suspicious. I found the envelope yesterday. Thomas accepted it gently and examined the torn seal. Someone had opened it deliberately. That much was obvious. When did this arrive? He asked. I'm not sure. It was mixed in with ordinary mail. The letter itself was gone. Thomas returned the envelope. I think you should contact them. Danielle nodded slowly. I was thinking the same thing. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt a quiet sense of relief. She was beginning to ask the right questions. Across town, Daniel sat inside his office, pretending to concentrate on financial reports. In reality, he had spent nearly an hour searching county property records online. Every search ended the same way. Ownership information restricted. Additional verification required. Contact county archives. He slammed the laptop shut. This is ridiculous. His assistant appeared in the doorway. The bank called again. What did they want? They're asking about the ownership documents. I'll handle it. They sounded? She hesitated, concerned. Daniel forced a smile. Everything's under control. She nodded politely, though neither of them believed it. After she left, Daniel leaned back in his chair. For years, he had never questioned the mansion's legal status. Danielle had inherited it somehow. Or perhaps bought it before they married. Or maybe it had belonged to distant relatives. He honestly didn't know. He had never cared. Until now. Several miles away, Jonathan Hayes reviewed the latest trust timeline. His assistant entered carrying another folder. I believe we've found another route. Jonathan looked up. What is it? The estate manager. Thomas Walker, she nodded. He remains legally authorized to facilitate communication. Jonathan considered the idea carefully. Thomas had served the White family faithfully for decades. More importantly, Danielle trusted him. It may be our last opportunity before judicial intervention. He picked up the telephone. Please arrange a meeting. Thomas received the call shortly before noon. He listened quietly while Jonathan explained the urgency. The deadline is now less than 2 weeks away, Jonathan said. I understand. If Danielle isn't formally identified before, then we'll have to petition the court. Thomas looked toward the garden where Danielle was trimming lavender. She's beginning to ask questions. Good. But she still doesn't know. I know. Jonathan lowered his voice. Can you arrange for her to meet me? Thomas remained silent for several seconds. I believe so. Without telling her why? Yes. There must be no discussion of the trust until identity verification begins. I understand. When? Thomas glanced toward the calendar hanging beside his desk. Tomorrow afternoon. Excellent. Jonathan paused. And Thomas? Yes. Thank you. The old caretaker smiled faintly. I promised Mr. White I'd look after her. You've kept that promise. I intend to finish it. That evening, Thomas found Danielle walking through the greenhouse. She was watering orchids that had belonged to her grandfather. The flowers had survived decades because someone always cared for them. Mrs. Carter. She looked up. Yes. I received a phone call today. From whom? A law office. Her attention sharpened immediately. The same one. I believe so. They're asking if you'd be willing to meet regarding some family documents. Danielle frowned. Family documents, so they said. I don't have much family left. Thomas nodded gently. That may be exactly why they wish to see you. She remained quiet for several moments. Is something wrong? I honestly don't know. Would you go? Danielle looked down at the watering can in her hands. My grandfather handled everything himself. When he passed away, she stopped speaking. Thomas waited patiently. I never really understood what happened afterward. Then perhaps it's time. She smiled faintly. Perhaps. When? Tomorrow afternoon. I'll go. The next day arrived with clear skies. Danielle chose simple clothing, a beige blouse, navy slacks, and a light jacket. She had no idea she was about to take the first step toward learning the truth about her family's legacy. To her, it was merely a meeting with attorneys. Nothing more. Danielle barely noticed as she prepared to leave. I'm meeting someone about old family paperwork, she said. He looked up from his phone. What paperwork? I'm not sure. Who contacted you? A law office? His expression changed almost imperceptibly. What law office? She retrieved the business card Thomas had given her. Jonathan Hayes. Danielle recognized the name immediately. A cold sensation spread through his chest. He had seen that name on every confidential envelope he had intercepted. What do they want? I don't know. They said it concerns my grandfather. Danielle forced a casual smile. It's probably nothing. Maybe. You don't have to go. She looked at him curiously. Why not? It could just be old probate paperwork. Then it shouldn't take long. Danielle considered inventing an excuse. A family emergency, a sudden appointment, anything to prevent the meeting. Instead, he simply nodded. Fine. When will you be back? This evening. She left before he could think of another reason to stop her. The front door closed softly behind her. Danielle immediately walked to his office and locked the door. He opened the drawer where the intercepted letters remained hidden. There were 6 of them, all unopened after he had first read enough to recognize the sender. He had assumed they concerned inheritance taxes or forgotten family property. Nothing that mattered. Now he wasn't so certain. He searched for Jonathan Hayes online. The results appeared instantly. Senior trust attorney, estate administration, corporate succession, confidential family wealth planning. Danielle's heartbeat quickened. Corporate succession, family wealth. He stared at the screen. Could Danielle's grandfather have left something significant, number impossible? If there had been real money, someone would have mentioned it years ago. Wouldn't they yet doubt continued growing? Meanwhile, Danielle arrived at Jonathan Hayes and Associates. The receptionist greeted her warmly. Mrs. White. Danielle hesitated for a moment. I usually go by Carter. The receptionist smiled politely. Mr. Hayes asked that we use White today. Danielle found the request unusual. Still, she followed the receptionist down a quiet hallway lined with framed legal certificates and historical photographs. Jonathan Hayes stood as she entered the conference room. His expression was calm, but unmistakably relieved. Miss White. She offered a polite handshake. I'm sorry if I've missed your letters. Jonathan smiled gently. I believe that wasn't entirely your fault. She looked puzzled. I don't understand. You will. He gestured toward a chair. But before we discuss anything else, he placed a single folder on the polished table. There are several legal procedures we must complete. Danielle looked at the unopened folder. What kind of procedures? Jonathan answered carefully. the kind that determine who you truly are in the eyes of the law. Outside the conference room, the door quietly closed. For the first time in her life, Danielle stood only a few signatures away from discovering that everything she believed about her family's past was incomplete. The conference room was quiet enough that Danielle could hear the soft ticking of an antique clock mounted on the wall. Jonathan Hayes did not rush to speak. For more than 30 years, he had overseen some of the country's largest estate transfers. Experience had taught him that lives could change in a single conversation, and people deserved time to absorb the first moments before hearing the truth. He slid a glass of water toward Danielle. "Before we discuss the purpose of this meeting, I need to complete several legal requirements." Danielle nodded. "I understand." "I appreciate your patience." Jonathan opened the folder in front of him. Inside were neatly organized documents separated by colored tabs. Birth certificates, marriage records, property archives, trust agreements, notarized affidavits, family photographs. Everything had been assembled over months of preparation. "We'll begin with identity verification," Jonathan said. He placed a certified copy of Danielle's birth certificate on the table. "Could you confirm your full legal name?" She looked at the document. "Danielle Marie White." "And your date of birth?" She answered without hesitation. Jonathan checked the information carefully. "Your mother's name?" "Emily White." He nodded. "Your grandfather?" "Harold White." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "I had the privilege of representing Mr. White for many years." Danielle looked surprised. "You knew my grandfather?" "Very well. He spoke about you often." A quiet sadness crossed her face. "I still miss him." Jonathan smiled gently. "So do I." For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Finally, silently, Jonathan continued. "We'll also need your driver's license and passport." Danielle handed them over. He compared every signature, every photograph, every identification number. His assistant entered briefly with a mobile fingerprint scanner. "I apologize," Jonathan said. "The trust requires biometric verification." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "It sounds very serious." "It is." She extended her hand without objection. Within minutes, her fingerprints were electronically matched against archived legal records collected years earlier. Everything aligned perfectly. Jonathan quietly checked another item from his list. One requirement remained. "I also need your consent for a DNA comparison." Danielle looked puzzled. "My DNA?" "Your grandfather anticipated that future legal challenges might arise. He insisted every possible question be answered before any succession occurred." She studied his face. "Succession?" Jonathan realized he had chosen a word too revealing. He corrected himself carefully. "I mean, family verification." Danielle noticed the hesitation. She didn't challenge it. Instead, she calmly signed the consent forms. "If this helps settle whatever legal matter exists, I'm happy to cooperate." Jonathan admired her composure. Many people became anxious around complicated legal procedures. Danielle became curious. There was a difference. The laboratory occupied another floor of the same building. A certified technician collected the DNA sample while Jonathan waited nearby. The process lasted only a few minutes. "We'll compare today's sample with preserved biological records authorized by Mr. White many years ago," the technician explained. Danielle blinked. "My grandfather planned all of this," Jonathan answered. "He planned for almost everything." As they returned upstairs, Danielle found herself remembering childhood afternoons spent walking through the mansion gardens with Harold White. He had never spoken much about business. Instead, he taught her practical lessons: how to keep promises, why signatures mattered, why honest people documented important decisions. Truth survives longer than memory, he often said. At the time, she believed he was simply offering grandfatherly advice. Now, those words seemed strangely connected to everything happening around her. Back inside the conference room, Jonathan unlocked a secure cabinet built into the wall. He removed an old leather portfolio. Its edges showed decades of careful handling. This belonged to your grandfather. Danielle stared at it quietly. I remember that case. He carried it everywhere. Jonathan nodded. He instructed me to keep it sealed until your identity had been legally confirmed. She instinctively reached toward it before stopping herself. I suppose I can't open it yet? Not today. When? As soon as every legal requirement has been satisfied. She accepted the answer without complaint. Patience had always come naturally to her. Jonathan silently appreciated that quality. It would make the next stages considerably easier. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away, Margaret Collins stood inside the executive boardroom of White Mining Group. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked headquarters, stretching across several city blocks. Around the polished conference table sat directors responsible for operations spanning multiple states: rail transportation, mining, processing facilities, renewable energy investments, international export contracts. Every division ultimately traced back to one family, the White family. Margaret addressed the board. Our succession timeline remains unchanged. A director adjusted his glasses. Has the heir been located? Yes. Has verification begun? It has. Another executive asked quietly. Does she know? Margaret paused. Not yet. The room fell silent. Most directors had never met Danielle White. They knew her only through confidential reports prepared by Jonathan Hayes. Modest, private, educated, no history of financial misconduct, no significant debt, no public scandals. One director smiled faintly. Mr. White chose well. Margaret nodded. He always believed character mattered more than experience. Andrew Foster entered carrying another sealed folder. The financial transition package is complete. Margaret accepted it. Excellent. Inside were ownership certificates representing billions of dollars in assets. None of them would become effective until Jonathan completed the legal process. Everything waited, including the future of the company. At nearly the same time, Daniel Carter sat across from his accountant. Spread across the desk were invoices, loan statements, and cash flow projections. The accountant removed his glasses. We have a serious problem. Daniel leaned back. How serious? You've overextended nearly every available credit facility. We'll refinance. Using what collateral? Daniel hesitated. The house. The accountant sighed. Have you confirmed ownership? I'm working on it. You've been working on it for weeks. I know. Daniel. The older man folded his hands. If the property isn't legally yours, your entire financing strategy collapses. Daniel forced a laugh. It is mine. Can you prove it? Silence answered for him. The accountant closed the folder. I strongly recommend delaying every major investment until this issue is resolved. Daniel stood abruptly. I don't delay opportunities. No. The accountant replied quietly. That's exactly what worries me. Late that afternoon, Danielle completed the final interviews required by the trust. Jonathan reviewed the checklist one last time. Identity confirmed. Government identification verified. Family lineage documented. Biometric records completed. DNA processing underway. Everything had progressed more smoothly than he expected. He finally closed the file. "There's one more thing." Danielle looked up. "Yes." Jonathan walked toward the window overlooking downtown traffic. "When your grandfather retained our firm, he gave us very unusual instructions." "What kind of instructions?" "He said that if the day ever came when we met again, I was to ask you only one question before revealing anything." Danielle waited patiently. Jonathan turned back toward her. "He believed your answer would determine whether you were ready." She smiled slightly. "What was the question?" Jonathan spoke slowly. "If you suddenly possessed more wealth than you could spend in 10 lifetimes, what would you do first?" Danielle looked genuinely surprised. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she thought carefully. Several moments passed. Finally, she smiled with quiet sincerity. "I would repair the things people usually ignore." Jonathan remained silent. She continued. "My grandfather used to tell me that wealth isn't measured by what you build. It's measured by what you preserve." "I suppose." She looked down thoughtfully. "I'd preserve whatever he worked so hard to create." Jonathan felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. Her answer was almost identical to something Harold White had told him decades earlier. He smiled. "I think he'd be very proud of that answer." Danielle laughed softly. "I wish I could ask whether he'd agree." Jonathan glanced toward the sealed leather portfolio resting inside the cabinet. Soon she would no longer need to wonder. Soon she would discover that her grandfather had spent decades preserving something extraordinary for her. As Danielle left the law office, she still believed she had attended an unusually complicated meeting about forgotten family documents. She had no idea that every signature she had placed on those papers had brought her one step closer to becoming the legal heir to one of the largest privately owned mining empires in the United States. And inside the mansion, she still called home. Daniel unknowingly continued making financial decisions based on a house that had never belonged to him. By the end of the week, Daniel had convinced himself that appearances mattered more than certainty. The banks were asking questions. His accountant had warned him repeatedly. Ownership documents remained unavailable. None of that stopped him from planning the largest party the mansion had hosted in years. "If people see confidence," he told Olivia, "they'll never suspect hesitation." Olivia smiled approvingly. Exactly. She had already hired an event planner. Luxury floral arrangements arrived first. Then came crystal chandeliers on temporary stands to illuminate the ballroom. A string quartet rehearsed beneath the grand staircase. Professional caterers transformed the dining hall into something resembling an exclusive gala. Dozens of invitations had been sent to developers, investors' attorneys, city officials, and social influencers. Daniel wanted everyone important in one room. He believed the evening would strengthen his reputation. The narrator already knew it would preserve something far more valuable: evidence. Thomas Walker watched preparations quietly from the entrance hall. Every contractor signed a visitor log before entering. Every delivery truck was photographed. Every invoice was copied. When decorators mounted temporary cameras to assist the event security team, Thomas carefully requested access to their recording schedule. The security supervisor looked puzzled. "You want copies, if possible. Why?" "The estate maintains permanent historical records for major gatherings." The explanation sounded reasonable. It was also true. The White family had documented important events inside the mansion for decades. This gathering would become important for reasons no one yet understood. Before leaving, the supervisor handed Thomas a printed equipment map. Every ballroom, every hallway, every entrance. every camera angle. Thomas folded it carefully and placed it inside a secure folder. He had the uncomfortable feeling that history was preparing to record itself. Upstairs, Danielle quietly arranged fresh towels inside the guest bedroom. Since Olivia had moved into the master's suite, this smaller room had become her refuge. Its single window overlooked the rose garden. The view reminded her of peaceful mornings with her grandfather. She preferred it to the noise downstairs. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood outside. "May I come in?" "Of course." He stepped inside carrying a small tray. Tea, lemon slices, homemade biscuits prepared by the kitchen staff. "I thought you might appreciate something quiet before the guests arrive." She smiled warmly. "You always know." Thomas looked around the room. Unlike the master's suite, nothing here appeared extravagant. Books occupied the shelves. Family photographs rested neatly beside the bed. A leather notebook remained open on the writing desk. "You've made this room your own." Danielle nodded. "It isn't where I expected to be." "No. But peace isn't determined by square footage." Thomas smiled. "Your grandfather used to say something similar." She looked toward the window. "I miss him most on days like this." "So do I." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Thomas asked gently, "Will you come downstairs tonight?" Danielle considered the question. "I suppose I should. It is still my home." Thomas lowered his eyes briefly. "Yes, it is." The words carried a meaning Danielle could not yet understand. That evening, luxury vehicles began arriving shortly before 6. Valets opened polished doors. Guests stepped onto the circular driveway wearing tailored suits and elegant evening gowns. Soft music drifted through the open entrance as servers welcomed everyone with champagne. Daniel stood near the staircase, greeting investors with practiced confidence. Olivia remained beside him. Her emerald evening dress shimmered beneath the lights. She looked entirely comfortable, accepting compliments, as though she had lived in the mansion for years. "This estate is extraordinary," one guest remarked. Olivia smiled. "It really feels like home." Daniel wrapped an arm around her waist. "We've been making improvements." Another guest admired the carved staircase. "You've preserved the history beautifully." Daniel nodded proudly. "We're planning additional renovations." Thomas overheard every word. Without appearing obvious, he quietly noted the time. 6:18 p.m. Guest conversation regarding ownership. Multiple witnesses present. He slipped the notebook back into his jacket. Facts, only facts. Danielle remained upstairs until most guests had arrived. She wore a simple navy dress. No expensive jewelry, no dramatic makeup. Only the silver pendant her grandfather had once given her for her 21st birthday. When she entered the ballroom, conversations softened almost immediately. Many guests recognized her. Some had attended the wedding years earlier. Others simply remembered seeing her around the estate. She greeted everyone politely. Nothing more. Daniel noticed her from across the room. For a brief second, something resembling guilt crossed his face. It disappeared almost instantly. He walked toward her, carrying 2 champagne glasses. "You could smile." Danielle accepted neither glass. "I'm smiling. You don't look enthusiastic." "I didn't realize enthusiasm was required." Daniel lowered his voice. "Please don't create tension tonight." "I wasn't planning to." She calmly walked past him. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. No raised voices, no argument. Yet something about Danielle's quiet dignity made Daniel appear strangely defensive. Later, Olivia gathered several influential guests near the fireplace. She enjoyed being the center of attention. "This house has so much potential," she said. "I'm thinking about redesigning the library next." One woman asked casually, "Will you keep the original woodwork?" Olivia laughed. "It's too old-fashioned. I want something modern." Another guest smiled. "So you'll be living here permanently," Olivia answered before Danielle could speak. "That's the plan." Danielle happened to be passing nearby carrying a tray that one of the servers had accidentally left unattended. She intended only to return it to the catering staff. Olivia looked directly at her. "Oh. Would you mind taking this to the kitchen?" Several conversations stopped. Danielle looked down at the tray, then back at Olivia. "I was already heading that way." She accepted it calmly, not because she had been ordered, simply because someone needed the tray returned. One investor quietly watched the exchange. Something about it unsettled him. He whispered to his wife, "I thought she owned part of this place." His wife answered softly, "I don't know anymore." Neither of them realized how close they had come to the truth. As the evening continued, Daniel stepped onto a small platform prepared for speeches. He tapped his glass gently. The ballroom fell silent. "I'd like to thank everyone for joining us." Polite applause followed. This house has witnessed many wonderful memories. He looked toward Olivia. "And tonight begins an exciting new chapter." Olivia smiled proudly. Daniel continued, "I've always believed a home should reflect the people shaping its future." He extended his hand toward Olivia. "I couldn't ask for a better partner." More applause. Several guests glanced toward Danielle. She remained near the back of the room beside one of the tall windows. She neither applauded nor frowned. She simply observed. Quietly, carefully. Her notebook rested inside her handbag. She had no intention of writing during the party. Some moments became impossible to forget without ink. Near the entrance hall, Thomas discreetly checked the security monitor installed temporarily for the event. Every camera functioned perfectly. Ballroom, library, dining room, front entrance, main staircase. The recording indicator glowed steadily. Everything spoken, everything done, everything witnessed would remain preserved. He quietly saved duplicate recordings onto an encrypted storage drive provided by the estate's permanent security office. One copy for routine archives, one copy locked inside the estate's safe. Experience had taught him an important lesson. People often remembered events differently. Video rarely did. Around 9 o'clock, Olivia approached Danielle once more. "You've been awfully quiet tonight." Danielle smiled politely. "I usually am." "You could mingle more." "I've spoken with several guests." Olivia folded her arms. "You know, sometimes it's healthier to let go of the past." Danielle studied her calmly. "I agree." Olivia seemed pleased. "Good. I think everyone should know where they truly belong." Danielle's expression never changed. "So do I." For reasons she couldn't explain, Olivia suddenly felt uncomfortable. It wasn't Danielle's words. It was the certainty behind them, a certainty completely unsupported by anger. As though Danielle already trusted something Olivia couldn't see. Across the room, Thomas watched the exchange unfold beneath 3 separate security cameras. He quietly checked his watch. 9:07 p.m. Every word had been recorded, every expression preserved. By the time the music faded and the final guests departed, Daniel believed the evening had strengthened his public image. Instead, without realizing it, he had hosted an event that documented false claims, public humiliation and unauthorized assertions of ownership inside a mansion that legally remained protected by the White family trust. And hundreds of miles away, Jonathan Hayes had just received confirmation that Danielle's DNA results matched every historical record without exception. The final legal barrier was beginning to disappear. Monday morning began with a single email. It arrived in Andrew Foster's secure inbox at 7:12 a.m., carrying the highest internal confidentiality classification used by White Mining Group. Subject: external financial inquiries concerning protected trust assets. Andrew read the first page once, then again. By the third reading, he no longer doubted what had been happening for months. Several financial institutions had independently contacted the company's legal department requesting verification of ownership connected to the White family estate. Each inquiry referenced the same mansion. Each inquiry originated from lending applications submitted by Daniel Carter or companies under his control. No authorization existed. No board approval had ever been issued. No trustee had granted permission. Someone had repeatedly attempted to leverage protected trust property without legal authority. Andrew immediately stood. This can't wait. He carried the report directly to Margaret Collins. The interim CEO was already reviewing production reports from mining operations in Wyoming, and Nevada when he entered. "You look concerned," she said. "I am." He handed her the report. Margaret read silently. The deeper she went into the file, the more serious her expression became. He used the estate as collateral. Multiple times. Did any bank approve the loans? Not after requesting ownership verification. She closed the folder carefully. Fortunately. Andrew nodded. If those loans had closed, untangling the legal consequences would have taken years. Margaret walked toward the window overlooking the headquarters campus. "Our priority remains Danielle." Agreed. But Jonathan should see this immediately. Andrew was already dialing the number. Jonathan Hayes answered before the second ring. "I was expecting your call." Andrew sounded surprised. "Were you?" "I've spent enough years practicing law to recognize patterns." "What kind of patterns?" "The kind that appear when someone mistakes possession for ownership." Andrew briefly summarized the report. Every bank inquiry, every collateral request, every rejected verification. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When Andrew finished, Jonathan spoke calmly. "Gather everything." "I already have." "I'll need certified copies." "You'll have them today." "And Andrew?" "Yes. Do not contact Mr. Carter." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. People often reveal more when they believe no one is watching." Andrew smiled faintly. "I'll let the evidence continue speaking." "Exactly." At the mansion, Danielle was kneeling beside a flower bed near the eastern garden. The weekend's party had left scattered footprints across the lawn, but the flowers themselves remained untouched. She carefully removed wilted blossoms, one by one. Thomas approached, carrying a gardening basket. "You always start with the damaged flowers," she smiled. "They're easier to save early." He handed her a pair of pruning shears. Wise advice. Danielle looked toward him. "I've been thinking about the meeting with Mr. Hayes, and it felt," she searched for the right word, "important." Thomas nodded quietly. It was. They never actually explained what all those documents were for. They couldn't. Why not? Legal procedure. She sighed. "I suppose patience is required." Thomas smiled. "More than most people realize." She laughed softly. "My grandfather used to say patience and truth usually arrive together." Thomas looked toward the old oak tree standing beyond the garden. He was right. Neither of them noticed Daniel watching from the second-floor office window. He couldn't hear their conversation. He only saw them talking, for reasons he couldn't explain that troubled him. Later that afternoon, Jonathan invited Danielle back to his office. This meeting felt noticeably different. Several additional legal professionals were present: a certified court reporter, a notary public, 2 trust administrators. Everything proceeded with remarkable precision. Jonathan greeted Danielle warmly. "Thank you for returning. I assumed there was more paperwork." "There is." She laughed gently. "I'm beginning to think lawyers survive entirely on paperwork." The room smiled. Jonathan appreciated that she still seemed relaxed despite the increasingly formal process. He gestured toward a thick binder. "Today's purpose is straightforward. We'll review your family history." Danielle looked puzzled. "My family history?" "As documented. The first pages contained birth records, marriage certificates, military service documents, land purchases dating back nearly a century. Gradually, the timeline expanded. Old mining claims, railroad acquisitions, energy investments, corporate mergers." Danielle frowned. "I don't understand." Jonathan turned another page. Each generation of the White family had carefully preserved ownership through trusts and corporate restructuring. The documents stretched across decades. "My grandfather was involved in all this," Jonathan answered carefully. "He was responsible for much more than most people realized." Danielle stared at the records. "He never spoke about business." "No. He spoke about responsibility." Jonathan smiled. "That sounds like him." She continued reading. Several pages referenced something called White Mining Holdings. Others mentioned White Industrial Rail Corporation. Another listed mineral rights across multiple states. The scale seemed impossible. "These companies," she looked up, "are they all connected?" Jonathan paused. "They are. To my grandfather." "Yes." Danielle fell silent. Questions crowded her thoughts. She wanted answers. Jonathan knew exactly which answer she wanted most. He simply wasn't permitted to provide it yet. Not until every verification process concluded. Across town, Daniel sat in another meeting with his accountant. The mood had worsened considerably. The accountant slid several letters across the desk. "These arrived this morning." Daniel recognized bank logos immediately. "Loan review, additional documentation required, credit reassessment, potential default." His stomach tightened. "They're overreacting." The accountant remained calm. "They're responding to uncertainty. It's temporary. So resolve it." "I'm trying." The accountant leaned forward. "Daniel, when was the last time you actually saw a deed proving you owned that house?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You've never seen one, have you?" Silence answered. The accountant sighed. "I strongly suggest hiring a property attorney before making another financial decision." Daniel stood. "I don't need another lawyer." "No." The accountant replied quietly. "You may need several." That evening, Olivia was browsing luxury furniture catalogs in the mansion's living room. She circled expensive sofas, imported lighting, custom Italian cabinets. Daniel barely glanced at the pages. "We should wait." She looked surprised. "Wait. For what?" "Until everything settles." "What does that mean?" "Nothing." She closed the catalog. "You've changed." "I'm being careful." "You've never been careful." "I am now." Olivia studied him carefully. "Is something wrong with the house?" Daniel answered too quickly. "No." "The banks?" "No." "Your business?" "No." She crossed her arms. "Then why do you look terrified every time someone mentions paperwork?" He didn't answer. His silence said enough. Later that night, Danielle sat alone in the guest bedroom, reviewing her notebooks. One by one, she reread entries written over the previous months. Dates, conversations, deliveries, phone calls, changes inside the mansion. None of them seemed especially important individually. Together, however, they formed a timeline. She noticed something unexpected. Nearly every unusual event had begun shortly after confidential letters first started arriving. The realization made her pause. She retrieved the empty envelope once again. Jonathan Hayes and Associates. Why had someone opened it? Who had removed its contents? And why had no one told her about it? Instead of guessing, Danielle opened a fresh page in her notebook. She wrote 3 questions. Who intercepted the letter? Why? What information was someone trying to prevent me from receiving? She closed the notebook. Answers would come later. Speculation helped no one. The following morning, Jonathan received the final laboratory report. DNA comparison completed. Identity confirmed. Probability of direct biological lineage exceeded every legal threshold required under the White family trust. He read the report carefully before placing it into Danielle's confidential file. At last, every scientific and legal requirement had been satisfied. Only one formal step remained: the official recognition meeting. Jonathan picked up the telephone. "Margaret, I'm here. It's time." She understood immediately. The board is ready. So is the trust. What about Danielle? Jonathan smiled quietly. She's about to learn not only who her grandfather truly was, but also why he spent his entire life protecting something he intended only one person to inherit. Neither of them realized another pair of ears had just begun listening. Outside Jonathan's partially open office door, a junior courier paused while delivering mail. He heard only 4 words before moving on. One person to inherit. The sentence meant nothing to him, but inside the office it marked the beginning of the final stage. From that moment forward, the truth would no longer remain hidden for very much longer. Daniel Carter had always believed that confidence could replace certainty. For years it had. Investors believed his presentations because he spoke with conviction. Clients trusted his promises because he never sounded uncertain. Even when projects fell behind schedule, he projected complete control. But confidence had limits, and the law was one of them. On Tuesday morning, Daniel drove to the offices of Sterling and Loa Title Services, convinced that a simple document request would finally silence every bank questioning his ownership of the mansion. The receptionist greeted him politely. "Good morning. How may we help you?" "I need a certified ownership package for my residence." "Certainly." She handed him a short request form. Daniel completed it quickly before sliding it back across the counter. She entered the property address into her computer. Her smile faded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter." "What?" "This file requires additional authorization." "I am the owner." "I understand that's what you've stated." "I live there." "Yes. But our records indicate the property is protected under a private trust." Daniel forced a laugh. There must be a mistake. The receptionist remained professional. "I'm unable to access the complete file." "I'll speak with your supervisor." Minutes later, a senior title officer entered the meeting room, carrying a tablet. He reviewed Daniel's request before speaking. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid we cannot issue ownership documentation today." "Why not?" "The title remains under restricted legal administration." "I've lived there for years." "I understand." I pay maintenance. I understand. My wife inherited it. The officer looked directly at him. Our records don't authorize me to discuss beneficiaries. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Beneficiaries? I'm sorry. That's all I can say. He left the office carrying nothing except growing uncertainty. For the first time, someone had not merely delayed the documents. Someone had refused them. Across town, Jonathan Hayes received notification that Daniel had attempted another title inquiry. He wasn't surprised. One of the safeguards built into the White family trust automatically alerted the trust administrator whenever unauthorized ownership verification was requested. Jonathan quietly added another note to Danielle's confidential file. Attempted title acquisition. Denied pursuant to trust protection. Pattern consistent with previous financial activity. His assistant entered moments later. The board has confirmed tomorrow's schedule. Jonathan nodded. And Danielle? She accepted the invitation. He closed the file carefully. Good. Everything must proceed exactly as planned. Meanwhile, Danielle spent the morning helping Thomas supervise repairs to an old greenhouse damaged during the previous week's storm. The workers replaced cracked panes of glass while she carefully transplanted young rose bushes into larger containers. Thomas watched her work for several minutes. You never seem overwhelmed. She smiled. I am. You don't show it. Showing it wouldn't solve anything. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Your grandfather handled problems the same way. She laughed softly. People keep telling me that. He would have liked hearing it. She paused. I wish I remembered more about him. Thomas looked toward the estate stretching beyond the gardens. He remembered everything about you. The sentence lingered longer than either expected. Danielle looked at him. What do you mean? Thomas chose his words carefully. He always planned further ahead than most people. She considered that answer. It raised more questions than it answered. Still, she didn't press him. Experience had taught her that Thomas spoke only when the time was right. Daniel returned to his office frustrated. His assistant stood immediately. Mr. Carter, I don't want interruptions. There is one matter. What? She handed him a printed email. The message came from Crescent National Bank. Final request for verified ownership documentation. Failure to provide documentation within 5 business days may result in suspension of pending financing. Daniel read the message twice. His jaw tightened. He called the bank immediately. The loan officer answered. Mr. Carter, I've already told you the documents are coming. We've been waiting. I've encountered administrative delays. We understand. No, you don't. The officer remained calm. Our responsibility is to verify collateral. I own the property. Can you prove that? Daniel looked through the office window without answering. After several seconds, the officer spoke again. If documentation cannot be produced, we'll close the application. The line went silent. Daniel ended the call without another word. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely trapped. That evening, Olivia spread renovation sketches across the dining table. I've spoken with 3 interior designers. Daniel barely glanced at the drawings. Not now. We need to decide. I said not now. She folded her arms. You've been avoiding every conversation. I'm busy. No. She looked directly at him. You're scared. He looked up sharply. I'm not scared. Then tell me why every bank keeps calling. He hesitated. Business. What business? The normal kind. Olivia shook her head. Nothing about this feels normal anymore. She lowered her voice. Daniel, does this house actually belong to you? The room became perfectly still. He answered almost immediately. Of course. But even to his own ears, the words sounded weaker than ever before. Upstairs, Danielle sat quietly beside the window in the guest bedroom. Rain tapped softly against the glass. She opened another notebook and reviewed every meeting she had attended with Jonathan Hayes. She listed facts instead of conclusions. Identity verification completed. Fingerprint verification completed. DNA sample collected. Historical family records reviewed. Additional meeting scheduled. She underlined the final line. Additional meeting. Tomorrow. She still had no idea what Jonathan intended to reveal. Yet she sensed the process was nearing its conclusion. Oddly, she felt less nervous than grateful. Whatever truth waited ahead had already existed long before she discovered it. Learning it would not change the past. Only her understanding of it. Hundreds of miles away, inside White Mining Group headquarters, the executive boardroom had been prepared for a confidential meeting unlike any held in decades. Fresh nameplates were arranged around the long walnut table. At the head sat a single leather chair that had remained symbolically empty since Harold White's death. Margaret Collins paused beside it. She remembered the founder's final board meeting years earlier. He had been older, physically weaker, mentally sharper than ever. Before leaving the room that day, Harold had rested one hand on the empty chair. "The next person who sits here," he had quietly said, "must value responsibility more than power." No one had occupied the seat since. Not Margaret, not any director, not even the interim executive committee. It had waited. Andrew Foster entered carrying several sealed binders, the ownership certificates. Margaret nodded. The board resolutions. Ready. Corporate governance documents. Ready. Asset transfer schedules. Ready. He placed the binders neatly beside the empty chair. Everything necessary to transfer authority over one of the largest privately held mining enterprises in the United States had finally been assembled. Only one signature remained missing. Danielle White's. The following morning, Danielle arrived once again at Jonathan Hayes' office. This time, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. No fingerprint scanner waited on the table. No identity documents required review. Instead, a single leather portfolio rested neatly before Jonathan. She recognized it immediately. My grandfather's case. Jonathan smiled. Yes. This time, he gently turned the portfolio toward her. You're finally allowed to open it. Danielle rested her hand lightly on the worn leather. For a long moment, she didn't move. Years of unanswered questions seemed to gather in that single, silent pause. Jonathan watched patiently. Outside the conference room, the legal team stood ready. Across the country, the White Mining Group board waited for his call. And back at the mansion, Daniel still believed his greatest problem was proving ownership of a house. He had no idea that within hours, the woman he had spent months humiliating would learn she was not merely connected to the estate. She was about to discover that she legally stood above every property, every company, every executive, and every fortune her grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting. The final revelation had begun. Danielle rested both hands on the worn leather portfolio without opening it immediately. It felt strangely familiar. She remembered seeing her grandfather carry it through the gardens, into the library, and occasionally into the small study where he spent quiet evenings reading documents after everyone else had gone to bed. As a child, she had once asked what he kept inside. He had smiled and answered with unusual seriousness. Responsibilities. At the time, she thought he meant bills. Now sitting across from Jonathan Hayes, the memory carried an entirely different weight. Jonathan remained silent. He wanted the moment to belong to Danielle. Finally, she released the brass clasp. The portfolio opened slowly. Inside rested a handwritten letter on thick, cream-colored stationery. Her grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. She swallowed hard. "May I?" Jonathan nodded. "It was written for you." Danielle carefully unfolded the letter. The first line alone was enough to bring tears to her eyes. "My dear Danielle, if you are reading this, it means the law has finally allowed the truth to find you." She paused. Her grandfather's voice seemed almost alive in every sentence. Jonathan quietly waited while she continued reading. The letter contained no mention of wealth, no discussion of money. Instead, Harold White wrote about character. He thanked Danielle for remaining kind, even when kindness offered no reward. He reminded her that patience often protected people better than anger. He wrote that power revealed a person's heart far more clearly than poverty ever could. Then, near the end of the letter, his words changed. "Everything I spent my life building was never intended to make someone rich. It was intended to protect thousands of families who depended upon honest leadership. If the law has placed that responsibility in your hands, accept it with humility." Danielle lowered the letter. Her eyes had become moist. "I still don't understand." Jonathan gently slid another folder toward her. "You will." Inside rested the original White family trust agreement. Its first pages contained legal definitions she barely recognized. Further inside appeared organizational charts, ownership schedules, corporate structures, mining licenses, transportation subsidiaries, energy investments, international partnerships. She looked from one page to another. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't." Jonathan folded his hands. "Miss White, your grandfather did not simply own a successful business. He controlled one of the largest privately held mining enterprises in the United States." Danielle stared at him. The words refused to settle into reality. She shook her head slowly. "No. He never talked about any of this. He intentionally avoided it." "Why?" Jonathan answered softly. "He wanted you to grow into the person you became before learning what you would inherit." Silence filled the room. Danielle looked back down at the documents. White Mining Group, White Industrial Rail, White Energy Resources, White Mineral Holdings. Each corporation listed the same ultimate ownership structure. White Family Trust. Beneficiary, Danielle Marie White. She read the line 3 times. "I..." Her voice disappeared. Jonathan waited patiently. Finally, she managed to ask, "How much?" Jonathan hesitated, not because he wished to hide the truth, because no simple answer existed. The trust controls assets valued in the tens of billions of dollars. Danielle leaned back slowly. Her breathing became shallow. She wasn't excited. She wasn't smiling. She simply looked overwhelmed. Jonathan had expected exactly that reaction. "Take your time." She looked around the room. "I came here thinking this was old probate paperwork." "I know. I thought maybe my grandfather had forgotten some land somewhere." Jonathan smiled gently. "He remembered everything." She laughed softly through tears. "Apparently." After several quiet minutes, she looked directly at him. "Can I refuse?" Jonathan blinked. "Refuse? I don't know anything about mining. I don't know anything about running companies. I've spent years organizing gardens and grocery lists." Jonathan smiled with genuine admiration. That's exactly why Mr. White chose you. She looked confused. I don't understand. He believed knowledge could be learned. Character could not. Hundreds of miles away, the executive board of White Mining Group gathered inside the headquarters auditorium. Unlike ordinary shareholder meetings, today's attendance was strictly limited. Only board members, senior executives, corporate legal counsel, outside auditors, no media, no public announcements. Margaret Collins stood behind the podium. She reviewed the agenda one final time. The first item remained blank, pending confirmation from Jonathan Hayes. Andrew Foster quietly approached. Has he called? Not yet. The board is ready. Margaret glanced toward the empty chair at the head of the table. So am I. Every executive in the room followed her gaze. For years, no one had occupied that seat. Not out of superstition, out of respect. It belonged only to the lawful head of the White family. Back inside Jonathan's office, another set of documents waited. Jonathan slid them across the table. These require your review. Danielle looked at the titles. Certificate of Beneficial Ownership, Trust Acceptance, Confidentiality Agreement, Corporate Succession Resolution. She smiled nervously. This feels unreal. It often does. I've never signed anything this important. Jonathan nodded. That's why we'll review every page together. For nearly 2 hours, they proceeded line by line. Jonathan explained each provision carefully. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was hidden. When Danielle asked questions, he answered each one completely. What happens to the employees? They remain employed. The communities near the mines. The company continues supporting them. The scholarships, they continue. The safety programs, they continue. She looked relieved. My grandfather started those. Jonathan smiled. Most of them. I'd like them to continue. I suspected you would. Not once did Danielle ask how much money she would personally receive. She never asked about luxury homes, private aircraft, investments, cars. Jonathan quietly noticed what she asked instead. The workers, the families, the towns, the environmental restoration projects, the educational foundations. Each answer seemed to reassure her more than the last. At one point, she closed the folder. I think I finally understand. Jonathan looked at her. This isn't really an inheritance. No. It's a responsibility. Jonathan smiled. Your grandfather would agree. At almost the same moment, Daniel walked into the headquarters of White Mining Group. He believed he had secured a preliminary meeting with executives regarding a possible commercial real estate partnership. A junior assistant greeted him politely. Mr. Carter. Yes. If you'll follow me. She escorted him toward the executive conference level. Daniel admired the building's elegant interior. Everything reflected quiet confidence rather than unnecessary luxury. He assumed successful negotiations awaited. As he reached the executive floor, something unusual caught his attention. Employees seemed unusually focused. Directors arrived carrying confidential folders. Senior attorneys entered restricted meeting rooms. No one appeared interested in him. He checked his watch. Perhaps he had arrived early. The assistant stopped outside a large boardroom. They'll begin shortly. Excellent. She smiled politely before leaving. Daniel adjusted his tie. Whatever financial difficulties he currently faced, a successful partnership with White Mining Group could change everything. He had no idea that the meeting taking place inside had nothing to do with his business. Everything inside that boardroom revolved around one name: Danielle White. Back in Jonathan's office, the final page awaited. Jonathan placed a fountain pen beside it. "There is no pressure. If you need another day." Danielle gently shook her head. "My grandfather trusted me." "He did. I don't want to spend my life wondering whether I trusted him." She signed. One signature, calm, steady, deliberate. Jonathan countersigned immediately. The notary completed her certification. Another attorney added the final witness signature. Jonathan looked up. "It's done." Danielle stared quietly at the completed documents. Nothing around her looked different. The room remained the same. The city outside the window continued moving. Traffic flowed normally. People hurried along sidewalks, unaware that inside one conference room, ownership of a vast American mining empire had just passed to its rightful heir. Jonathan reached for the telephone. "It's time to notify the board." He dialed Margaret Collins directly. She answered before the first ring had fully ended. "Jonathan," he smiled. "The succession is complete." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Years of waiting had finally ended. "We'll receive her." Jonathan looked toward Danielle. "I believe she's ready." Across the country, executives quietly rose to their feet as Margaret announced only 7 words. "The rightful heir has accepted the trust." Daniel Carter, waiting just outside the executive boardroom for what he believed was a routine business meeting, heard the applause echo through the closed doors. He smiled confidently, certain that opportunity was waiting for him. He had never been more wrong. Ket Thuk Fan 11. Tiep Tuk Yukao, Viet Du 1000 to 1200, Tu Theo Quidin. Part 12. The applause inside the executive boardroom lasted only a few seconds. Then silence returned. Margaret Collins looked around the table at the directors who had spent years protecting an inheritance that could never legally become their own. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Today isn't about celebrating wealth. It's about fulfilling Mr. White's final instruction." Every director nodded. They understood the difference. For nearly a decade, the White Mining Group had been guided by caretakers, not owners. Every major decision had been made with one understanding: eventually someone would rightfully take responsibility. That day had finally arrived. Margaret picked up the secure telephone. "Bring Miss White upstairs." Danielle stepped out of the elevator a few minutes later. Jonathan Hayes walked beside her carrying only a slim leather folder. The rest of the legal team remained behind. This meeting belonged to Danielle. As the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, she paused. The hallway stretched ahead beneath soft lighting and framed photographs documenting nearly a century of the White family's industrial history. Black and white images showed miners standing proudly beside early excavation equipment, rail workers posing beside newly completed tracks, community schools funded by the White Foundation, hospitals built in remote mining towns. Nothing resembled the extravagant image Danielle had associated with billion-dollar corporations. Instead, every photograph reflected people, communities, families. She stopped before one particular picture. A much younger Harold White stood beside a group of miners wearing identical work clothes. No expensive suit, no luxurious office, just a hard hat and dusty boots. Jonathan smiled. He insisted on working underground at least once every month. Danielle looked at the photograph for several seconds. That sounds exactly like him. He believed leadership began by understanding the people doing the hardest work. She nodded quietly. I understand now why he kept talking about responsibility. The boardroom doors opened. Every person inside stood, not because of ceremony, Because the company's bylaws required directors to rise when greeting the lawful chair of the White family trust. Danielle immediately became uncomfortable. "You don't have to," Margaret interrupted gently. "We do? This isn't for wealth. It's for the office you now hold." Danielle looked around the room. Executives, attorneys, financial officers, people with decades of experience, all waiting respectfully. Margaret approached first. "I'm Margaret Collins. We've been protecting your grandfather's company until today." Danielle shook her hand. "Thank you. I think I should be thanking you." Margaret smiled. "Mr. White always hoped you'd say that." One by one, the directors introduced themselves. Andrew Foster stepped forward last. "I'm responsible for the company's financial records." Danielle smiled politely. "I imagine you've had a difficult few weeks." Andrew laughed softly. "You have no idea." The atmosphere remained warm rather than formal. Nobody attempted to impress Danielle. Nobody overwhelmed her with numbers. Instead, Margaret walked her toward the empty leather chair at the head of the table. "It has waited for you." Danielle stopped. "I don't think I'm ready to sit there." Margaret answered without hesitation. "Neither did your grandfather." The sentence made Danielle smile. Slowly, she took her seat. Not proudly, not dramatically, simply because the responsibility could no longer remain empty. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, Daniel Carter checked his watch for the 4th time. He approached the receptionist. "I believe I'm scheduled to meet with someone from corporate development." The receptionist searched her computer. "Your meeting has been delayed." "How long?" "I'm not sure." Daniel sighed. "Can you tell them I've arrived?" "I'll send another message." She picked up the phone. A few moments later, she returned. "They've asked for your patience." Daniel forced a smile. "Of course." He sat back down. Through the closed boardroom doors, he occasionally heard quiet voices. Once someone laughed. Another time, applause. He assumed executives were concluding another meeting before seeing him. He never imagined every minute of delay was bringing him closer to learning a truth that would destroy every assumption he had built his future upon. Inside the boardroom, Andrew Foster connected a large monitor. "I'd like to show you something." The screen displayed a map of the United States. Colored markers gradually appeared. Nevada, Wyoming, Arizona, Montana, Colorado. Processing plants, rail terminals, research facilities, renewable energy projects, scholarship foundations, environmental restoration sites. Danielle stared quietly. "I thought mining meant mines." Andrew smiled. "It also means people." He zoomed into another map. "This school was funded after your grandfather discovered children in one mining town traveled nearly 40 miles every day." Another image appeared. A regional hospital. Then another. Water restoration projects. Margaret watched Danielle carefully. Every time another community project appeared, Danielle leaned slightly forward. She asked about graduation rates, medical services, environmental recovery, worker safety. She never asked about profit margins, stock value, executive compensation. Jonathan noticed the same pattern. Harold White had predicted it perfectly. Years earlier, he had written one line in his private instructions. "If Danielle asks first about the people rather than the money proceed exactly as planned," Jonathan quietly folded the instruction back into its envelope. There would be no need for contingency plans. His client had understood his granddaughter better than anyone. After nearly 2 hours, Margaret closed the presentation. "There is one remaining matter." Jonathan stood. The legal documentation. He distributed certified copies to every director. Each document carried official seals from the trust, the court-appointed notary, and independent auditors. Ownership transfer, trust activation, board recognition, corporate authority. Every page had already been reviewed. Now they became part of the permanent corporate record. Margaret looked toward Danielle. "Would you like to say anything?" Danielle hesitated. The room waited patiently. Finally, she stood. "I don't know enough to give speeches." Several directors smiled. She continued, "My grandfather clearly trusted all of you. So do I. I don't intend to change everything. I intend to learn. And before making any major decision," she glanced around the room, "I'd like to visit every operation personally." Andrew looked surprised. "Every operation?" She nodded. "I can't ask people to trust me if I don't first understand how they live and work." Silence followed. Not because anyone disagreed, because the statement sounded remarkably familiar. Margaret smiled. "Your grandfather said almost the same thing during his first board meeting." While Danielle was meeting the board, Jonathan's legal department had begun the next phase. Evidence. For weeks, attorneys had quietly assembled every document connected to Daniel Carter's financial activities involving the White estate. Certified bank correspondence, loan applications, email records, property inquiries, security footage, maintenance records, witness statements, Thomas Walker's detailed logs. Nothing had been obtained illegally. Nothing relied upon rumor. Everything came from ordinary business records preserved through careful documentation. Jonathan reviewed the growing file. "Has every exhibit been certified?" A paralegal nodded. "Yes." The surveillance footage authenticated. The banking records received directly from the institutions. The title searches complete. Jonathan closed the final binder. The evidence spoke clearly. No emotional arguments would ever be necessary. Late that afternoon, Danielle prepared to leave headquarters. Margaret accompanied her to the elevator. "Tomorrow, we'll begin orientation." Danielle smiled. "I think I'll need it. I think you'll do very well." The elevator doors opened. As Danielle stepped inside, another elevator arrived across the hallway. Daniel Carter emerged carrying his briefcase. For a brief second, husband and wife looked directly at one another. Daniel blinked. "Danielle?" She looked equally surprised. "What are you doing here?" He laughed awkwardly. "Business meeting." "You?" She answered honestly. "Mine too." Before either of them could continue, Jonathan Hayes stepped into view beside Danielle. "So there you are, Miss White." Daniel recognized him instantly. The attorney from every confidential envelope. Jonathan acknowledged Daniel with nothing more than a polite nod. Then he turned back to Danielle. "Our driver is waiting whenever you're ready." The elevator doors quietly closed. Daniel remained standing in the hallway, confused, uneasy, watching the elevator descend. For reasons he could not explain, the sight of Jonathan Hayes addressing his wife, as Miss White, sent a chill through him, stronger than any warning from a bank or accountant ever had. Something enormous had just happened. He simply had no idea what it was. Daniel remained motionless long after the elevator doors had closed. The hallway outside the executive boardroom suddenly felt much quieter than before. He replayed the last few seconds repeatedly. Miss White, not Mrs. Carter, not Danielle Carter. Jonathan Hayes had addressed her by her maiden name with deliberate precision. More importantly, Danielle had not corrected him. The detail unsettled him far more than he wanted to admit. His phone vibrated. It was Olivia. He ignored the call. For the first time in years, even she felt unimportant compared to the questions now racing through his mind. A receptionist approached him politely. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "I'm afraid today's meeting has been canceled." He stared at her. "Canceled? I'm very sorry. No one told me. We were instructed to reschedule." "When?" "I don't have that information." Daniel forced a polite smile before leaving the building. The moment he reached his car, he searched Jonathan Hayes online again. Senior trust attorney, corporate succession, estate administration, family wealth planning. Then he searched another phrase: White Mining Group ownership. The results revealed almost nothing. The company remained privately held. Ownership information was unavailable. Board governance was confidential. Daniel frowned. Private companies rarely concealed ownership so thoroughly. Unless... He stopped the thought before finishing it. No, it couldn't be connected to Danielle. Could it? Back at Jonathan Hayes and Associates, another conference room had been transformed into what looked almost like a courtroom. Certified binders lined one side of the table. Large display monitors stood ready. A court reporter organized transcripts. Independent forensic accountants arranged spreadsheets. Jonathan entered, carrying a single instruction. "Today we organize. We do not accuse." His legal team understood immediately. Evidence would remain persuasive only if presented without emotion. One attorney opened the first binder. "Bank records." Jonathan nodded. "Certified. Directly from the institutions." "Excellent." Another paralegal placed several flash drives onto the table. "Security recordings." "Authenticated. By the original vendor." Jonathan examined the labels. Grand ballroom, library hallway, front entrance, main staircase. Every recording came from the evening of Daniel's charity reception. Every camera angle had been preserved by Thomas Walker before the temporary security system was dismantled. Jonathan smiled quietly. The estate manager deserves our gratitude. He documented everything. He always does. At the White estate, Thomas sat inside his small office reviewing his notebooks. 42 years of service had filled several shelves with carefully dated journals. He removed only the most recent volume. Inside appeared neat entries written almost every day. Delivery records, maintenance requests, visitor logs, contractor arrivals, conversations. Nothing sensational, nothing exaggerated, only facts. A gentle knock interrupted him. Danielle stood in the doorway. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Never." She entered carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might enjoy a break." Thomas accepted one, gratefully. "Thank you." She sat across from him. "I wanted to ask you something." He waited patiently. Did my grandfather ever seem worried? Thomas thought carefully. Worried? About leaving everything behind? He smiled faintly. No. He prepared. For years, he trusted preparation more than worry. Danielle looked down at her cup. I've learned more about him this week than I knew during the last 10 years. Thomas nodded. He always intended that. She laughed softly. I still don't understand how. There are some answers people only appreciate when the time is right. She looked at the shelves behind him. You've kept journals. For decades. I have. My grandfather taught you too. Thomas smiled. He taught everyone who worked for him. What? Write facts. Not feelings. Feelings change. Facts remain. Danielle smiled. I suppose that's why I always kept notebooks. Thomas looked at her warmly. perhaps? Neither of them realized how valuable both collections would soon become. The following morning, Jonathan's legal team received the final banking certifications. Every financial institution had responded. Every loan application submitted by Daniel Carter involving the mansion had been verified. None had succeeded. However, each application contained written representations claiming authority over property Daniel did not own. Jonathan carefully highlighted the relevant sections. He wasn't preparing criminal allegations, only civil evidence, misrepresentation, unauthorized financial claims, potential breach of fiduciary obligations. Every conclusion would ultimately belong to the court, not to him. A young associate looked impressed. "You've barely spoken about Mr. Carter personally?" Jonathan smiled. "I don't need to. The documents already have." Meanwhile, Olivia grew increasingly impatient. She found Daniel sitting alone inside the library, staring at printed property searches. "You've been doing this for days." "I know." She crossed her arms. "What's going on?" He rubbed his forehead. "Nothing." "Stop saying that. You don't believe me anyway." "I want to." "Then tell me the truth." Daniel hesitated. "The banks want ownership documents." "So give them the documents." "I can't." "Why not?" "They're—" He searched for the least alarming explanation. "Being reviewed." Olivia looked unconvinced. "Reviewed by whom?" He didn't answer. Her expression slowly changed. "You've never actually seen the deed." Silence. "Have you?" Daniel looked away. Olivia took a slow step backward. "My God. You don't even know if this house belongs to us." He finally spoke. "It belongs to Danielle." "Then why are the banks refusing it?" Again. Silence. For the first time since moving into the mansion, Olivia felt genuine fear. Not because of money, because certainty had disappeared. Several hundred miles away, Danielle spent her first unofficial afternoon reviewing White Mining Group's community investment programs. Margaret Collins walked beside her through a large archive room containing decades of historical records. Photographs covered entire walls. Mining towns before restoration. The same towns years later. Schools, medical clinics, libraries, scholarship recipients. Margaret handed Danielle another folder. "Your grandfather personally reviewed these every quarter." Danielle opened it. Inside were handwritten notes. Increase teacher funding. Expand safety training. Replace aging equipment before next winter. Support widows after the accident. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Harold White. There were no notes about luxury. No reminders about personal wealth. Everything concerned people. She quietly closed the folder. "I understand now." Margaret looked at her. "What?" He wasn't building an empire. He was protecting communities. Margaret smiled. "Exactly." "And now," Danielle finished softly, "it's my turn." That afternoon, Jonathan received confirmation from the court. A civil hearing had been scheduled, not because Danielle sought revenge, because legal ownership questions required formal judicial recognition once financial misrepresentations had been documented. Jonathan immediately called Danielle. "I wanted you to hear this from me." She listened carefully. "Will Daniel be arrested?" "No." "Will there be criminal charges?" "None that I'm aware of." She sounded relieved. "So this is simply about establishing the truth?" "Yes." "And correcting the legal record?" She remained quiet for a moment. "I don't want him humiliated." Jonathan answered gently. "The court doesn't exist to humiliate. It exists to determine facts." She smiled faintly. "Good. That's all I wanted." Jonathan ended the call with quiet satisfaction. Even now, after learning she controlled billions in assets, Danielle's first concern remained proportional justice rather than punishment. Harold White had judged her character perfectly. Late that evening, Thomas walked through the mansion after everyone else had gone to bed. He checked windows, locked doors, security systems, exactly as he had done for decades. Before turning off the library lights, he paused beside a framed photograph of Harold White. "You chose well," he said quietly. His voice echoed softly through the empty room. From his pocket, he removed the final notebook covering the months since Daniel had begun bringing Olivia into the estate. Every significant event had been documented. He placed the notebook inside a fireproof archive cabinet, locked it, then slipped the key into an envelope addressed to Jonathan Hayes. His responsibility was nearly complete. The evidence no longer depended upon memory. It rested securely within authenticated records, certified financial documents, surveillance footage, and written observations gathered patiently over many months. Outside, dawn was still hours away. Inside the mansion, everyone slept beneath the same roof. Yet by the end of the coming week, a federal courtroom would separate assumption from ownership, appearance from truth, and silence from justice. The final chapter had begun. The federal courthouse stood in quiet contrast to the attention the case could have attracted. There were no television cameras gathered outside, no reporters waiting along the courthouse steps. Jonathan Hayes had successfully requested that much of the proceeding remain focused on civil property and trust matters rather than becoming a public spectacle. Danielle appreciated that. She had never wanted headlines. She wanted the legal record to be accurate, nothing more. As she stepped from the car that morning, she wore a simple charcoal gray suit with a white blouse. No expensive jewelry, no visible symbol of the fortune she now legally controlled. Jonathan walked beside her. "Nervous? A little? That's normal. I keep wondering if this could have been avoided." Jonathan considered the question before answering. Only if everyone had respected the truth from the beginning. Danielle nodded quietly. She accepted the answer without another word. But inside another vehicle across the street, Daniel sat staring through the windshield. Olivia occupied the passenger seat. Neither had spoken for nearly 15 minutes. The silence finally ended when Olivia asked the question both had been avoiding. "Do you know why we're here?" Daniel answered honestly. "No. I know it involves the house. And I think that's only part of it." Olivia looked toward the courthouse entrance where Danielle disappeared inside with Jonathan Hayes. "You never told me there were attorneys involved." "I didn't know. You told me the property belonged to your family." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I believed it did." Olivia's voice remained calm. Believing isn't the same as knowing. He couldn't disagree. For months, he had built decisions upon assumptions he had never verified. Now, those assumptions were bringing him into federal court. The courtroom itself felt surprisingly ordinary. Wood-paneled walls, simple benches, no dramatic atmosphere, only quiet professionalism. Judge Patricia Morgan entered precisely on time. Everyone stood. She reviewed the case file before speaking. "This proceeding concerns ownership, interests, trust administration, and related financial representations." Her tone remained measured. "This court is not here to punish pride. It is here to determine facts." Danielle found herself appreciating those words. They reflected exactly what she had hoped. Jonathan rose first. "Your Honor, we intend to establish ownership through certified documentary evidence." "No emotional argument," Judge Morgan asked. "No, Your Honor." "Excellent." She turned toward Daniel's attorney. "Any preliminary matters?" The attorney stood. "No, Your Honor. We ask only that the documentary evidence speak for itself." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Jonathan called his first witness, Andrew Foster. The company's chief financial officer approached calmly. After taking the oath, he explained his responsibilities: oversight of financial records, corporate asset documentation, trust-related accounting. Jonathan displayed the first exhibit, certified ownership schedules. Andrew identified every document. The chain of ownership remained uninterrupted for decades. White Family Trust. Protected administration. Danielle White is the sole lawful beneficiary upon completion of succession procedures. Jonathan asked one question. Did Mr. Daniel Carter ever possess legal authority to pledge the White estate as collateral? Andrew answered clearly. No. Was such authority ever granted? No. Did the company authorize anyone else to do so? No. Nothing more. Jonathan sat down. Cross-examination lasted less than 5 minutes. The documents spoke more clearly than either attorney could. Next came representatives from 2 lending institutions. Each testified independently. Each described similar events: loan applications, collateral requests, ownership verification, requests for certified title documents. Each institution had suspended financing after receiving incomplete or unverifiable ownership information. One loan officer summarized the situation simply: "We were unable to establish legal ownership." Judge Morgan made several notes. Again, there was little room for interpretation. Facts aligned, records matched, timelines remained consistent. Jonathan's next witness surprised nearly everyone. Thomas Walker, the elderly estate manager, walked slowly to the witness stand. His posture remained straight despite his age. After taking the oath, Jonathan asked gently, "How long have you served the White family?" 42 years. Were you familiar with Harold White? Very. Did your responsibilities include maintaining estate records? Yes. Jonathan introduced Thomas's notebooks. Each volume had been dated, signed, preserved in ordinary business practice. Judge Morgan carefully examined one of them. "You've maintained these continuously, every working day, for decades." Thomas nodded. Mr. White believed facts should be recorded while memories were still fresh. Jonathan smiled faintly. "So do you." "Yes." Several entries were displayed: dates of contractor visits, unauthorized renovations, guest events, delivery records, conversations concerning occupancy. Nothing sensational, nothing exaggerated, simply routine documentation. Daniel watched silently. He suddenly understood why Thomas had always carried a notebook. He had mistaken quiet observation for harmless habit. Instead, it had become one of the most reliable records presented to the court. Jonathan requested permission to introduce authenticated security footage. Judge Morgan approved. The courtroom monitor illuminated. Video from the charity reception appeared. Daniel standing before guests, Olivia beside him. The ballroom filled with witnesses. No audio manipulation. No selective editing. The recording showed Daniel presenting Olivia as though she belonged in the mansion. Another camera angle captured Olivia instructing workers regarding permanent renovations. Another showed guests discussing ownership. Another revealed Danielle quietly carrying her belongings toward the guest room without argument. No dramatic soundtrack, no narration, only reality. Judge Morgan watched carefully. When the recording ended, she looked toward Jonathan. Authentication. The original recording vendor and independent forensic analysts have certified chain of custody. Accepted. Daniel lowered his eyes. Watching himself on the screen proved more uncomfortable than any accusation. No one needed to describe his behavior. He could see it himself. After a brief recess, Daniel chose to testify. His attorney asked straightforward questions. Did you believe the mansion belonged to your household? Yes. Did you intentionally attempt to steal trust property? No. Why did you submit the loan applications? I believed I had authority. Jonathan rose for cross-examination. He approached without raising his voice. Mr. Carter, when was the last time you personally reviewed a certified deed to the property? Daniel hesitated. I never did. So you assumed ownership? Yes. Did any attorney ever tell you the property belonged to you? No. Did any trustee authorize you to use it as collateral? No. Jonathan nodded. No further questions. The courtroom became quiet. Daniel realized the damaging admissions had come from his own answers, not from accusations. From truth. Olivia was called only briefly. She testified that Daniel had repeatedly assured her he controlled the estate. She admitted she had relied entirely on his representations. She also acknowledged ordering renovations without verifying ownership. I believed what I was told. Judge Morgan thanked her. Her testimony added context. Nothing more. Late that afternoon, Judge Morgan returned with her findings. Everyone stood once again. She reviewed several pages before speaking. The documentary evidence establishes uninterrupted ownership through the White family trust. She looked toward Danielle. The lawful beneficiary and controlling owner is Miss Danielle White. Jonathan remained expressionless. He had expected nothing else. The judge continued. Mr. Daniel Carter possessed no legal authority to represent the property as collateral. Accordingly, all financial representations based upon such authority are declared without legal effect. She ordered the relevant loan filings corrected, property records updated where necessary, civil claims dismissed in accordance with the trust documentation. Finally, she looked directly at Daniel. This court finds no benefit in humiliation, but it does require accountability. You are expected to cooperate fully with all corrective actions. I will. Daniel's answer came quietly. There was no anger left in his voice, only exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan asked Danielle whether she wished to make any public statement. She looked toward the small group of waiting reporters. No. Are you sure? Very. What would you like people to know? She smiled gently. Only that the truth eventually belongs to itself. Jonathan nodded. That's enough. As Daniel exited the courthouse several minutes later, their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke. Danielle offered a small, respectful nod. Not victory, not forgiveness, simply acknowledgement. Daniel returned the gesture. For the first time in many months, he understood that everything he had lost had begun long before the courtroom. It had begun the day he valued appearances more than honesty. As Danielle walked toward her waiting car, Margaret Collins joined her. The board is ready whenever you are. Danielle looked toward the horizon. Tomorrow. I'd like my first day to be spent visiting the people my grandfather spent his life protecting. Margaret smiled. I think he'd approve. Together they left the courthouse behind, not as conquerors celebrating an opponent's defeat, but as two women preparing to carry forward a legacy built not merely on wealth, but on responsibility. Autumn arrived quietly. The first golden leaves drifted across the stone pathways of the White estate, settling beneath the same towering oak trees that had watched 4 generations of the White family come and go. The mansion felt different now. Not because new furniture had arrived. Not because expensive renovations had transformed its appearance. In fact, Many of Olivia's unfinished redesigns had been carefully reversed. The original paintings once again hung above the grand staircase. The handcrafted dining table returned to its familiar place. Family photographs filled the library's shelves, exactly where Harold White had always wanted them. The house had not become grander. It had simply become itself again. Danielle preferred it that way. She walked slowly through the front hallway just after sunrise. There were no servants following behind her, no executives waiting for instructions. She carried a mug of coffee in one hand and a small leather notebook in the other. Some habits, she had decided, should never change. Thomas Walker met her near the entrance. "Good morning." "Good morning, Thomas." He looked around the restored foyer. "It feels familiar again." Danielle smiled. "It always belonged to history more than to us." Thomas nodded. Mr. White used to say houses remember the people who respect them. She looked toward the staircase. I believe he was right. For several moments, they stood quietly listening to the peaceful silence that had returned to the estate. Months earlier, the same hallway had echoed with forced laughter, false confidence, and whispered assumptions. Now there was only calm. It suited Danielle far better. Her first months leading White Mining Group surprised nearly everyone. Executives had expected sweeping reforms. They received careful observation instead. For weeks, Danielle visited every major operation before making significant decisions. She toured underground mines wearing the same safety equipment as every employee. She rode freight trains transporting raw materials across mountain regions. She spoke with equipment operators during lunch breaks. She met teachers whose schools depended upon company scholarships. She visited clinics funded through the White Foundation. Rather than spending hours inside executive offices, she spent them listening. Margaret Collins accompanied her on nearly every trip. One afternoon, after visiting a mine in Wyoming, Margaret asked quietly, "When are you going to begin changing things?" Danielle looked toward workers finishing their shifts. "I already have." Margaret smiled. "How?" "I'm learning." "You can't improve something you don't yet understand." Margaret laughed softly. "You sound exactly like your grandfather." "I hope that's a compliment." "It is." Andrew Foster quickly noticed another change. Every board meeting now began with the same first question. "How are our people doing?" Not quarterly profits, not market forecasts, not share valuations. The people. Worker safety reports came first. Community investment updates came second. Financial performance followed afterward. One director privately remarked that meetings somehow felt both shorter and more meaningful. No one argued. Decisions became clearer when everyone remembered why the company existed. Several months after the court proceedings concluded, Danielle quietly established the Harold White Community Legacy Initiative. She refused to place her own name on the program. Jonathan Hayes asked why. She smiled. "My grandfather spent his life building these opportunities. I don't need credit for continuing them." The initiative expanded scholarships for mining families, modernized aging hospitals in rural communities, created additional safety training centers, funded environmental restoration projects near former mining sites. At the announcement ceremony, Danielle declined to stand behind the podium until local teachers, nurses, and mine supervisors had been recognized first. Reporters noticed. So did employees. Leadership, they realized, had quietly changed. Jonathan Hayes visited the estate one final time before officially closing the original trust file. He found Danielle sitting in the library, surrounded by old family photographs. She looked up and smiled. "I was hoping you'd stop by. I have something for you." He placed a single folder on the table. A Across the front appeared familiar handwriting. White Family Trust. Jonathan sat across from her. Every legal requirement has now been completed. She rested one hand on the folder. So this is really the end. He shook his head gently. No, it's simply the end of my part. She laughed softly. I suppose that's true. Jonathan removed another envelope. Your grandfather left one final instruction. Danielle looked surprised. Another one. He told me that after everything was complete, I should remind you of something. She waited. Jonathan smiled. He said, never measure your success by what you own. Measure it by what remains better after you've passed through. Danielle looked down quietly. I'll try. Jonathan stood. I believe you already are. Before leaving, he paused at the library door. I've practiced law for 38 years. She looked up. I've represented governors, founders, billionaires, and judges. He smiled warmly. Your grandfather made only one prediction about the future that I doubted. What was that? He told me you'd become the finest steward the White family had ever produced. And now? Jonathan looked around the restored library. I think he underestimated you. Thomas Walker retired that winter. The decision had been planned long before Harold White passed away. He simply wanted to remain until Danielle truly came home. On his final afternoon, Danielle walked with him through the gardens. Snow rested lightly across the rose bushes now sleeping beneath the season's frost. You've spent nearly half your life here, she said. Thomas smiled. It was a good place to spend it. I don't know how to thank you. You already have. How? You listened. She looked puzzled. He continued. Most people believe loyalty is rewarded with money. It isn't. It's rewarded by knowing the right person is carrying the responsibility. Danielle hugged him gently. I'll miss you. I'll still visit the roses. They both laughed. Before leaving through the front gates one final time, Thomas looked back at the mansion. For decades, he had protected someone else's legacy. Now he could finally leave, knowing it rested safely in the hands for which it had always been intended. Daniel Carter quietly disappeared from the public attention he had once chased so desperately. After cooperating fully with the court's corrective orders, he sold his remaining business interests to satisfy outstanding obligations. He accepted consulting work with a regional construction company far from the city, where reputation had once mattered more than honesty. Occasionally, he saw news articles mentioning Danielle's work. Community projects, environmental restoration, educational scholarships. He never contacted her, not because he remained angry, because he finally understood that some apologies belonged more in changed behavior than spoken words. Olivia eventually returned to her own career. She publicly admitted she had trusted appearances too easily. The experience humbled her in ways success never had. She, too, moved forward quietly. One spring morning, nearly a year later, Danielle stood alone on the mansion's front porch. The sunrise painted the eastern sky in soft shades of gold. She opened the same leather notebook she had carried through months of uncertainty. Its final blank page waited. For a long time, she simply looked across the gardens. Then she wrote one sentence. Truth never needed my voice. It only needed my patience. She closed the notebook. Behind her stood a restored home. Ahead of her waited communities depending upon wise leadership. Neither wealth nor revenge occupied her thoughts. Only responsibility. As she stepped down the front stairs toward another ordinary day of work, the mansion remained silent behind her. No longer a symbol of power, simply home. In the beginning of this story, it seemed as though silence belonged to the powerless. Danielle rarely argued, never sought public sympathy, and refused to answer humiliation with humiliation. To many people that looked like weakness, yet time revealed something different. Her silence was never surrender. It was patience anchored in truth. And truth has a remarkable way of surviving long after anger has exhausted itself. Daniel's downfall did not come because someone sought revenge against him. It came because assumptions eventually met facts. And appearances could not withstand careful documentation, honest records, and lawful process. The people who protected justice in this story did so quietly through notebooks, bank records, verified document security footage, and integrity that never demanded applause. Perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Real strength is often difficult to recognize while it is unfolding. It rarely announces itself. It simply continues doing what is right until the day the truth no longer needs defending. If Danielle's journey stayed with you, you're warmly invited to leave a like. We'd also love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is when you found this story. Your thoughts and reflections often become part of the conversation that makes these stories even more meaningful. And if stories of quiet courage, legal justice, and emotional resilience are the kind you enjoy, consider subscribing. There will always be another story waiting, one that reminds us that dignity, honesty, and patience never truly go out of style.